Welcome to Ideas Live. I'm Anne-Marie Oomen, and this is my co-host,
Karen Anderson.
And we are both here today to have a deep conversation about a particular topic. That's the nature of the show. And today, after maybe a run of some of these darker topics, we've talked about addiction and homelessness and failure. We're going to talk about joy. I mean, it's the fall season and the weather's changing, and this is a time I think that's hard for people. So to bring maybe a contrary current to that whole feeling, I was wondering if we could talk about joy.
Harder than it sounds, really.
It is. As we've been looking at it, it seemed like it's a much bigger topic than what I realized. And then, of course, immediately came the questions like, what is it?
Right.
Because it seems that there must be a distinction, I don't know how you feel about this, but between joy and happiness or contentment.
Yes. And is it just a difference of degree, or is it actually a different experience? I mean, when I've talked with a couple people since I knew we were going to be discussing it, and it seems most people think of joy as just kind of an enhanced version of happiness, or but
is that how you feel about
it? No, joy seems, I don't know, maybe more pure, more intense, more. I don't know. When have you been joyful?
Well, for me, joy isn't necessarily related to the things that make me happy. You know, it seems like I can find happiness lots of times in my work and in my career, or in even interactions with people I care about. But joy seems to come out of nowhere. You know, it seems like it's one of those things where all of a sudden a whole bunch of things come together, and I get this is going to sound really cliched, but it's like a little bit like being struck by lightning, you know, and all of a sudden you're in this brighter place. And it doesn't, for me at this point in my life, it doesn't seem to last terribly long. It's something I just kind of accept and ride with. It often has to do for me with being outdoors, with being in the natural world, particularly extended hours in the natural world. You know, that is part of my pleasure. Well, see, pleasure is a different pleasure I associate with the body. So yeah, that's where I am in those. That's how I see joy as being a sort of hierarchical pinnacle. That may be incorrect. I don't know. I mean, I'm not a practitioner of these positive feelings. I'd like to be.
I don't know.
You know,
I mean,
what
does
do you
anybody
think?
have a corner on joy in terms of defining it? I don't know. It seems to me a kind of peak experience sometimes. And I wore this jacket because I bought it in Kathmandu. It has bright colors, kind of a joyful
Yeah, I noticed.
jacket. But I bought it when I was on a trip to Nepal, which was, there was certainly joy in that trip. But it existed side by side, and it existed side by side with fear, with rigorous physical demands, discomfort, and yet there was, and it was because we were living outdoors, we were trekking and hiking and altitudes, and but the scenery was sublime. And so there was a sense of otherworldliness about even being there. Wow.
Oh, that's interesting. Otherworldliness.
That existed right alongside all the distress, like, will I be able to do this, and I better not fall down, or, you know, all that. But it was, as I think back, one of the more joyful experiences. And it was scary, but that was part of it. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense in terms of the way we separate joy from a sort of happiness that seems to simmer underneath. Yeah.
I think what struck me when you're talking about nature is that you're very much in the present moment in nature.
Often,
and
yes.
A lot of things, you know, the daily worries and so forth fall away. If you can be present, fully present in that moment in nature. I tend to, if I'm even just canoeing, or I'm just there. And I think that's a kind of joy.
Yeah. But I think ultimately I don't really know much about it because it does feel rare.
Can we create it, or do we just sort of wait for it to arrive?
Yeah, or is it something you have to practice? You know,
Probably.
How do you practice joy?
I would like
really
joy to be more the rule than the exception.
Yes,
I want
think
more
that's right.
joy.
Yeah, I want more joy.
So.
And in order to maybe talk about this a little further, someone who might give us a little bit of information about that, we have a guest. And a very interesting guest to talk about joy, and we will be right back to introduce her. Welcome back to Ideas Live. I'm Anne-Marie Oomen. This is my co-host,
Karen Anderson.
and today we are talking about our big idea is joy. It is a big idea, and we have a lot of questions about it, and we have a guest here, dear friend Susan Glassmeyer, who is going to help us kind of work through this topic for the next half an hour. And I want to introduce Susan, excuse me. She is a Feldenkrais practitioner trained in the spiritual psychology of psychosynthesis. I had to read that just to make sure I got it all right. She's also an incredible poet, and her book, Invisible Fish, has just been awarded the title, or she's been awarded through this book, Ohio Poet of the Year. So congratulations on that. And you were also the creator of a wonderful program called April Gifts, in which you sent beautiful poems to all of your friends or your circle of poems, one poem for each day of April, which was a remarkable feat, and they were beautiful poems.
Thank you.
So all of that puts you in a kind of unique position, I think, to speak to us, but particularly your work as a professional Feldenkrais practitioner and a therapist, to talk a little bit about joy. And so we're just kind of opening this up right now.
Can you define it?
Yeah, can you tell us what it is? Can you say anything about its characteristics? We're just going to put you on the spot here.
Yes, and I'm trying to be in my body while you put me on the spot.
Oh,
that's,
lovely.
That's where I would begin and where I invite my clients to begin. You know, when somebody comes in to see me, they've been on the road or come from work or some kind of chaos. So we kind of settle in first and pay attention to our breathing and go slower, to be present. You mentioned that earlier, Karen.
That's part of the being present. But what if when you're being present, the experience is not always joyful? Sometimes the perception is not a happy one. That's the beginning, though.
Right, because often when people come to see me, they're in pain, either physical pain or psychological pain or both. And to be present to that is a discipline. It's scary sometimes. It takes courage. And I think the foundation for that is what we could call joy. If you're really owning what's happening in the moment, not running away from it, there's a much better chance to experience the belly of that. You were saying how hard it was, you know, in Nepal, the physical hardship and maybe the food or the climate or how to breathe, and yet it was a joyful experience. And I think that's true psychologically and physically. When someone comes for a session, I'm looking at the whole person, including, of course, the story, but how they're telling their story can be so authentic and so real that there's a joyfulness in that that the personality wouldn't call happy. This isn't my happy place. My husband just yelled at me, or my child's in the hospital, or I just fell down on the ice.
Yeah.
The personality and the persona don't like those things. But what can we do with that? We're stuck with this body. This is where we start. So that's where I gear things to in my one-on-one sessions.
When we were talking previously about this idea that joy is a brief experience, but in our conversation, you talked about joy as abiding. Is that is that coming from this idea of being present, this mindfulness?
Yes, in the training with both psychosynthesis and Feldenkrais and sensory awareness, I spent 5 formal years training in that discipline. The heart of all of those things are being present, being aware in the moment, which is a meditation practice, you know, whether it's a Christian form of meditation or Buddhist form or just your own form of concentration. It's a way, it's a vehicle, it's an inroad to a place that gives us this sense that I think the Buddhists certainly call joy. Mudita is the word that they have used. When you look at the Dalai Lama, for instance, and he's been expelled from his country, he may never see his homeland again. He's suffering physically. I think he has some diagnoses and has to be careful about being in the sun. And so he has many things to complain about, but if you see him, he's always alert and vibrant and joyful.
You know,
but he's a master.
He seems to be the word. I was talking with a friend about joy last week, excuse me, and we mentioned the Dalai Lama because I had the book of Joy. And the thing that strikes me about his presence is this, what I would call equanimity. It's like he has the 35,000 feet view of things. Like he doesn't deny the suffering of himself and others, but he has some bigger picture, and that he can kind of just abide in a better place. He seems so unflustered, unruffled by all the distress.
I think in terms of the body, what expansion and contraction mean. Expansion is that view, that broad view, or you're up above, or you're larger, and you hold this reality, the tension of the opposites that I was mentioning, the difficult and the easy all at once. When you can sit in that arena, there's a calmness that comes into the body. It doesn't mean the problems go away. It doesn't mean that our child's not in the hospital still, or our father's dying, or we lost the job. But if the body's contracted and too tight and too wired, and you're unable to sleep and you're feeling pain, it's really hard to be happy, let alone joyful.
So where does the calmness come from? How do we get to the calmness?
It's a mystical question.
Well, that's why we have you here.
Yes, we could just meditate the rest of our time together. But slowing down, certainly.
Okay. Yeah.
Slowing down, paying attention, talking less and talking slower.
That's interesting.
Watching thoughts, but certainly slowing down speech. If somebody comes in and they want to tell me, as they do, many of my clients also have a psychotherapist. I'm not a psychotherapist or a clinical counselor, but I work adjunctively with psychotherapists. So my clients are talking down the road with their therapist, and I just try to ask the therapist and the client, please go slower. Be present in your body while you're telling this event that's going on in your life, in your personal life. When I invite a client to do that, oftentimes they just burst into tears because they've geared down. They're out of that fast lane so they can finally slow down and feel something. And that's scary. But if they're in an arena where they trust it, if they're with a friend or a guide or a therapist they trust, then it will happen. And there's nothing to do or fix.
So for you, that sort of finding joy is about being present enough to the moment to separate yourself from the tug and pull of fear and speed and anxieties. And so part of that puts you in a place, am I saying this correctly, a place where you're more likely to build or to begin to practice a kind of awareness that leads to joy?
Yes, I think that's all there is, that present moment. We keep hearing about that from so many different sources. We want to run away. We want to run away from the sorrows and the difficulties because the limited personality doesn't like those things. We want the future. We want things to be right again. We want everything to be going smoothly again. That's just the nature of being human. But I think we're here for bigger purposes than that, to just have happiness, pleasure, and enjoyment. Those are all fine. There's nothing wrong with it. But I think there's more.
What is the bigger purpose as you see it?
I think it's an evolutionary development of our spirit, whatever that means to each person. I don't think when our body dies that's all there is. Some people do, but there are millions of people in the world that think and believe, differently, that we'll return in some form or some fashion.
So when let's push a little bit more into this, how you think we connect to it. At one point in a previous conversation, you said, stop repressing it, which I thought was so wonderful. I don't ever think, why would you repress joy? But you were saying that if we're controlled by fear, and if we're controlled maybe by anxiety, you had another line that I absolutely loved, which was cultivate curiosity as a practice. Yeah. Do you have any ideas of how we repress it?
Yeah. Do we repress joy?
All the time, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
I have to catch myself. I feel like I repress my joy if I'm fixated on watching the news and the current events, and if I get lost in dwelling on what made me unhappy in the world or in our government. The things that I can't right now in this moment correct or change keeps me from feeling this birthright of joy. So it's hard work.
This birthright of joy,
And Roberto Assagioli, who developed psychosynthesis, was an Italian psychiatrist, and he believed that we repress the higher unconscious just like we repress the darker, shadowy parts that we don't want to look at.
Why?
Why? He says because if we had to face that or look upon the face of God, some people would translate it as that it would demand of us to be something other than just our self-centered humanness. That we'd
have to get around the ego.
Yes, and we would have to be interactive. I'm on this planet with you, and I'm here in this room with you today, and our dear Joe, wherever he is, he's part of this.
Behind the camera.
I'm aware of that. It's a real treat to be that focused, and it's easier for me with 2 or 3 people than it is in a crowd at a party or at a stadium. It's overwhelming to me as an introvert to be in that. So I require a lot of solitude, and I think joy demands that. You mentioned nature the other day, don't you think?
Yeah,
Nature's
the nature is a place where I find, even when I'm with people in the natural world, I am closer to a solitude that nurtures and is likely to put me in that place to be receptive and perhaps stop repressing it, because I really do feel that way when you say it that way, that sometimes our busy lives, and you said this too, we don't have time for that. Joy is something we'll work on later.
Yeah, when I get everything fixed.
Yeah.
And then sometimes when for a moment everything seems fixed and joy creeps in, I will watch my mind deliberately go look for something to worry about.
Yes.
And I think, Karen, look what you're doing. You have this little opportunity to actually celebrate the present joyful moment, and there must be something scary about it, because certainly there's so much suffering. I don't deserve to be happy, or whatever the story.
Maybe that's it.
The personality, ego thing that we tell ourselves. But is there something about our joyful self that's larger than our personality and our ego? Is that what
I
you're
would say so.
saying?
That's my understanding from. I mean, this is decades I've been studying this in a way, and I don't have the answer, but in the psychosynthesis perspective, there's I guess a preference, you'd call it, to getting to a place of stillness and quiet, a place of neutrality where you're aligned with, Assagioli called it a higher self, where you're not distracted by all these different aspects of personality or sub-personalities that we have, where you're a radio personality, you're a poet, I'm a healer. Those are labels that we put on aspects of our personality, and so we get pulled out of the middle, out of the center, because you have problems to fix. You have grandkids that need a toy for Christmas, or you've got a luncheon to get to, and people to please. And so, who are we doing that for? What is our purpose? What is our purpose? And
so part of putting yourself in the position to actually experience what is happening is prioritizing how much power you give those other demands?
Well, paying attention to them at least, to say, oh gosh, I have this quiet moment and I'm thinking I should call my secretary and see if she did this or that or the other. And what is that phenomenon? I just think it's that chronic push in the culture to stay busy, to get things done, to accomplish things, to please somebody, even some aspect of ourself that thinks that we're a better person if we do, rather than be.
That's what we're rewarded for in this culture,
Right.
though.
Yeah,
not for being, but for
Right.
doing.
So we get happiness, we derive happiness from doing things for grandchildren and our friends and our partners, and that's wonderful. But I think that's just kind of a minor key to this bigger flourishing possibility of joy. And that comes with practice. I have a note here somewhere. One of my colleagues says, whatever we practice, we get good at. And so if I'm practicing being busy and giving myself away to other people, I'll get very good at it. You see people's obituaries where somebody did, 1,000 things for other people.
Right.
It's beautiful. And also, did that person have a
Did they have some
unifying-
joy? Yeah.
Particularly women, I think, are often praised in their obituaries for having been selfless.
Yes.
And you think of what that word is,
Yes.
Yeah.
without a self,
Yeah.
because you're so busy doing for, I mean, it just gives me a chill.
I know Ayn Rand has taken a bad rap in many ways, but she has a book called The Virtue of Selfishness that I read when I was 18 years old, and it saved my life. It was
Really?
it was a therapeutic tool for me. I didn't have money to see a therapist, but I didn't know who I was. I really needed to cultivate. I mean, that was a very ego-based cultivation, but that was a start for me. So.
To start actually, as you say, being more sensitive to the messages of the present, the body, and the,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we just have this wonderful opportunity. You're also a poet, and you've written about this subject. So, is there a poem that would be appropriate right now for?
Well, yes, I get asked to read this one often. It's got a life of its own. It's ended up in places in the hands of people I've never met. It's titled "I Tell You," and this came from a real experience during my Feldenkrais training. Should I set it up a little bit? Do we
Sure,
have time
go
for
ahead.
that? My Feldenkrais training was 4 years long, and our educational directors would bring in individuals who had physical anomalies and difficulties, and in a fishbowl we would sit around and watch our teachers work with these people. And this is an event that happened. It's a 3-part poem. It's not a long poem, but it's the morning that I'm referencing, and then I'm in the workshop observing this event, and then I'm back in the garden in the evening. So I'll read this. It's titled, "I Tell You." I could not predict the fullness of the day, how it was enough to stand alone without help in the green yard at dawn, how 2 geese would spin out of the opal sun, opening my spine, curling my head up to the sky in an arc I took for granted, and the lilac bush by the red brick wall flooding the air with its purple weight of beauty, how it made my body swoon, brought my arms to reach for it without even thinking. In class today, a Dutch woman, split in 2 by a stroke, one branch of her body a petrified silence, walking, leaning on her husband to the treatment table, while we, the unimpaired, looked on with envy. How he dignified her wobble, beheld her deformation, untied her shoe, removed the brace that stakes her weaknesses, how he cradled her down in his arms to the table, smoothing her hair as if they were alone in their bed. I tell you, his smile would have made you weep. At twilight, I visit my garden where the peonies are about to burst. Some days there will be more flowers than the vase can hold.
I just think that line, "Some days there will be more flowers than the day can hold," is a perfect metaphor for joy.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like, oh, it's too big for the container, you know?
And we are witnesses to this if we slow down. There were 40 people observing the same thing. And I think there were 2 or 3 of us who saw this and took it in, had the capacity to take it in. And I think we all have the capacity. We just have to make room for it and pay attention. And that means slowing down thoughts and being where you are, occupying your body.
And this is going to sound simplistic, but I think seeing what you're seeing.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yes, it's very Zen-like, isn't it?
Well, I was thinking something similar in that you'd have to set aside assumptions, because maybe the assumption would be to feel toward this woman some kind of pity or sadness, or you know, make that would be the kind of traditional automatic response to that. But to see beyond that, to the love and the dignity and a different interpretation of the same situation, that does take slowing down, but also kind of cleansing our vision, or being able to see it new.
Exactly. And I've missed many things. I don't want to come across here as if, you know, I'm always paying attention. I miss many cues, but I'm aware of missing those cues after the fact.
There's a difference, yeah.
Maybe we couldn't. Maybe only Buddha could be aware of everything, you know, or Jesus or God. I mean, maybe it's a noble goal, but to be more present and more aware might be
I think we all have that capacity to become that avatar.
Yeah.
I think, you know, if there's truth to reincarnation, maybe that's why we come back 1,000 times, you know, to keep practicing.
Yeah, can't get it all in one lifetime.
No, it's too short.
Yeah.
I'm curious, though, in some of our notes, and Karen and I have talked about this a lot, the whole idea that the joy is side by side, often side by side with pain or suffering. I think an empathetic person who saw that woman being held in her partner's arms like that would feel pity or sorrow or even empathetic sadness for that. And then we all have our troubles. You know, we all have our sufferings. And to think of joy happening side by side with that, you know, how does that work? I don't think happiness and suffering can happen simultaneously, but I'm curious about and tend to believe that, yes, joy and suffering could happen side by side.
Can you say something more about that?
It reminds me of when my son was a little boy. He saw me crying, and it happened to be that I was crying about something that gave me deep joy. And he came to me and was concerned. He thought I was upset about something. I said, no, these are tears of joy. And he looked at me with a puzzled face, and I explained to him, and he was still puzzled. And I said, someday when you get older, you will have tears of joy. He wanted to know, when will I get tears of joy? And I said, when you're older. And we've talked about it a couple of times. And he's now 30 and this week, and he's had those tears of joy, and it's really a blessing, you know, to be in the company of somebody who can relate to that. I think that's one way of thinking about it. What about when how does this being present to the body, if you're, for instance, in intense physical pain, how do we start to work around that to the place of curiosity and awareness and the higher consciousness? Or is it simply, again, the process of practice? Yes, I think so. I think it's a labor of love, to pay attention and to love ourselves in whatever state we find ourselves in. And many of my clients have suffered, some of them, their whole lives. And yet they are remarkable whole people who are pleasant to be around, and you're happy to be in their company because they have this depth to them that's not all self-centered. You know, even though they have this broken body that still feels pain, it's not on the front burner for them all the time. It's there, but it's not, it doesn't drive them. So it's mysterious how each individual finds a way to work with that. I just know that in 40 years I've been working with hundreds and hundreds of people, and they leave feeling better than when they came in. And it's not because I've even necessarily touched them. Sometimes I don't. Sometimes it's just an invitation for them to talk from the core of themselves about what's going on, and not just this thinking brain. This is a computer, and it gets a lot of things done for us, but to tell about life from here allows them to expand so they can hold the pain. Quite literally, the body is fabulous that way, and the brain chemistry is fabulous, and you can actually sometimes be euphoric even though, you know, you're sitting with a broken bone. It's a mystery, but it's worth exploring, I think.
There's I may have referenced this before, but Stephen Levine has a wonderful CD on the grief process. But it's from a workshop of his. But the essence of the workshop is that our heart is large enough to hold our grief. It's larger. Our heart is larger than our grief. And that was sort of a new...
I like that a lot.
So you don't have to be afraid of taking in that pain, because the heart is large enough to hold it, and then some.
You make me remember, I met him when I was fairly young, and he was doing a workshop, and we were doing a Sufi dance, and he paused to talk about the heart, and he said, at this place on the sternum, esoterically, he said, every time we're injured, psychologically, emotionally, and physically, it's like there's this little layer of onion skin paper that goes over the heart center, and then another one, and another one, and another one, until we thicken up here, until we have like this armor on us. So we stop feeling the grief and stop feeling the loss. And so if we can remember to keep dissolving that, then we can get to that core again, that beautiful place of being human. We can all relate to it. You know, our eyes are tearing up when we talk about it, because we know that, you know.
That reminds me of another excerpt that you have, this beautiful line from Hope Chest.
Yes. This was a client. This is the last stanza. She was sick from an assortment of sicknesses. Your grown-up self finds hope is not contained in the body, but the body is one place to revolutionize the sorrow.
I think that idea of revolutionizing sorrow is just a really dynamic thought.
What does that mean?
To me, well, I should
Go
probably
ahead.
ask. Well, to me, it means if a revolution is a taking back or a taking over, or a, I mean, we have a probably negative connotation to the word, but I think it's revolutionizing sorrow would be to make it new in some way, or
transformation.
make it overturn it maybe.
This was a client, a very successful, conventionally everybody would say, but when she was greatly abused, emotionally, physically, and sexually abused, locked in a hope chest. That's the title, is from this. And I got her permission to write that poem and others in another book of mine called Body Matters. I got permission from all my clients to write narratives about them. And she tried to commit suicide when she was 8 years old on a swing. She tried to jump from a swing and thought it would all be over. She thought she would die. Instead, she broke her collarbone and didn't tell anybody about it, and lived with a broken collarbone her entire life that resulted in a whole shoulder replacement, and on and on and on, and a multitude of other troubles for her. So here was one of the more broken people in my practice who had the grandest life, who gave so much back to herself first, through years of self-searching, therapy, spiritual development, body work. So she would tell you if she were here that if I could do this, anybody could do this.
The line, hope is not contained in the body. What does that mean?
I understand the body as a vehicle, and that it's kind of a suitcase for our spirit.
Okay.
So I don't think of those invisible essences of joy and hope as being, once the body dies, they will still exist somewhere in the, somewhere.
So the body
I don't know.
isn't the source of joy. It just can experience
but it's a vehicle.
joy.
It can, yes. I think it can be physical, but it's that expansion again. If you're quite simply, if your muscles are tight and you're wired tightly and you're grimacing and you're walking, too fast, too hard, too crooked, whatever, it's going to be harder and a bigger challenge to
make room for.
Yes.
Right?
To make room for that revolution.
Yes.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. We need to. Gosh, this conversation could go on for a long time. I know you have one more poem, the introductions poem, which ironically I wonder if you could read here
Yes,
at the end.
very end.
Yeah,
It's a way to.
I think a lot of people have trouble with introductions in a group, especially when you're in a big circle. And we're always thinking about what the next person, or what they're saying, what I'm going to say, because the next person's busy and we're not listening. So I wrote this out of my own need, and it ties into the subject today perfectly, I think. Introductions. Let's not say our names or what we do for a living, if we are married and how many times, single, gay, or vegan. Let's not mention how far we got in school, who we know, what we're good at or no good at all. Let's not hint at how much money we have or how little, where we go to church or that we don't, what our sun sign is, our Enneagram number, our personality type according to Jung, or whether we've ever been rolfed, arrested, psychoanalyzed, or artificially suntanned. Let's refrain, too, from stating any ills, what meds we're on, including probiotics, how many surgeries we've survived, or our children's problems. And please, let's not mention who we voted for in the last election. Let's do this instead. Let's start by telling just one small thing that cost us nothing but our attention. Something simple that nourishes the soul of our bones. How it was this morning, stooping to pet the sleeping dog's muzzle before going off to work. Or yesterday, walking in the woods, spotting that fungus on the stump of a maple, so astonishingly orange it glowed like a lamp. Or now, just now, the sound of our own breath rising or sinking at the end of this sentence.
Wow, so paying attention.
Wow,
Yeah.
what a scary thought. Let go of all those things that we wear to create our identity, and just be nakedly present.
And to say the one, instead of talking about all of those things, to talk about the one thing that you saw that wasn't, I forget the line, wasn't related to those things. Yeah. Well, that's magnificent, and
Thank you. That's a great
I don't
way
know
to
if
wrap
I'm
up.
any closer to joy, but I do feel like I have thought deeply about it, which is joyful. It is.
I think it makes me aware of experiences of joy that maybe I'm not honoring, because my houseplants I pay attention to, and
They
and
respond.
They nourish me. Yes. And it's kind of like at the end of your poem, I think, oh, I spend time communing with my houseplants. I think that's a source of joy.
I didn't know that about you, but I quite like it. Susan, thank you. What a wonderful,
you.
wonderful
It's
thing
been
to
lovely.
have you here.
I feel like we should do it.
Yeah, namaste. And we'll be right back with the debriefing for Ideas Live. The topic is joy. Welcome back to Ideas Live. We have just finished an amazing interview with the poet and therapist Susan Glassmeyer, and on the topic of joy. And it was rich and interesting, and wow, I don't even really know where to start. I think one of the things that I was most impressed with was this whole idea that we can transform feelings about an experience without actually changing the experience. And that one way we might transform is toward joy.
And the recipe seems to have a lot to do with slowing down.
Right.
And getting in touch with our physical selves and just being in the present moment. She seemed to embody, so to speak, what she was describing.
Right, exactly.
And so I could feel myself just kind of...
Right. Yeah. I got happier as we went along.
I know.
Laughing more. Which is
magic.
maybe when we're sort of conscious, it's a little bit like meditating on a particular phrase or a word or even a verse from something important, that as you think about it and talk about it and write about it, it becomes more present to you and you begin to understand it more deeply and your body responds to it.
Yeah, I really do feel like somehow, and I couldn't tell you the recipe, but that I understand it better now, and that maybe I'm experiencing joy in ways I haven't been aware of and need to tune into.
Yeah, that whole idea of being present and not
calm,
repressing it, and being in a place where it can get through,
Right, set aside all the rest of it.
Right, right.
Well, what a rich,
rich topic. I feel like we could go more on it. One of the things I did want to say is that in our conversations previously, she talked about the experience of making art as another means of getting into or getting closer to joy. And I think that's really an important one to also consider, because when we are making and our creative self is active, I become very present in ways that I'm often not. And ironically, present to the point I forget time.
And you can write about things that are painful, and the writing of it creates joy. It's one of those paradoxes.
Because you're you're revolutionizing, I guess. That's what it is. So we are very happy to have been here today with Ideas Live. Please watch us again next month, and thank you.